All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we are tackling something pretty fascinating, how we actually go about measuring the greater good. We're going to look at this through the lens of two absolute giants of Enlightenment philosophy, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. I mean, we make choices every single day, right? But how do we definitively know if an action is right or wrong? Is there like an actual mathematical equation for morality? Well, that is exactly what we're going to explore.
So, to get us started, I want you to imagine this scenario. Picture a police officer who just caught a bomb maker, and this suspect admits a device is going to explode in exactly 1 hour. But the suspect completely refuses to talk. What do? Do you go by the book, wait for backup, and just accept that innocent people are going to die? Or do you break the rules and use force to extract that information? It's a terrifying dilemma. Are there absolute moral rules we must never, ever break, or does the end ultimately justify the means?
To figure that out, we're going to break this whole thing down systematically. We'll start with the principle of utility, unpack Bentham's hedonic calculus, and then put act utilitarianism to the test. After that, we'll see how Mill evolved the theory with rule utilitarianism, dive into strong versus weak rules, and finally evaluate the real-world flaws of these frameworks.
Okay, part 1, the principle of utility. This is essentially the bedrock foundation of the greater good.
This whole idea kicked off with a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. Think back to the Industrial Revolution. Bentham was looking around at the mass migration to overpopulated towns, the appalling working conditions, the disease, the poverty. He was totally disgusted by a legal system that seemed basically designed to protect wealth rather than help everyday people. He wanted a practical, measurable moral basis for law that could genuinely benefit society. Now, to understand his framework, we have to wrap our heads around 3 specific terms. First, his ethics are teleological, meaning they care strictly about the end purpose. Second, they are consequentialist. That means right and wrong are judged solely by the results of an action. Your motives, they don't matter at all. They are completely morally neutral. And finally, his theory is relativist. There are no universal moral rules here. Every single situation is entirely unique and has to be judged on its own merits. And that leads us to his absolute bottom line, the principle of utility. Basically, an action is the right thing to do if it brings about the greatest good for the greatest number of people, period. And how exactly does he define good? Strictly in terms of pleasure or happiness. It's a purely quantitative approach. You literally just count up the happiness. Moving right along to section 2, Bentham's hedonic calculus, the math of morality.
Bentham had this famous idea that nature has placed mankind under 2 ultimate bosses, pain and pleasure. They govern literally everything we do, say, and think. So his core equation was incredibly simple. Happiness equals pleasure minus pain. Bentham actually believed we could calculate morality like an algebra problem. If you add up all the pleasure an act creates and subtract all the pain it causes, you get a definitive, indisputable moral answer. The most moral act is always the one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain.
And this brings us to his hedonic calculus, which is a literal 7-step formula. First, you weigh the intensity of the pleasure. Then duration. How long is this feeling going to last? You measure certainty, as in how sure are you it'll actually happen, and remoteness. How soon will it happen? Then we look at fecundity, which is just a fancy way of asking if it'll trigger a domino effect leading to even more pleasure. Purity. Will it accidentally be followed by pain down the line? And finally, extent. Exactly how many people are going to be affected. You run any moral dilemma through these 7 steps, and the math just tells you what to do. All right, section 3. Let's see act utilitarianism in practice by testing this math on some brutal real-world dilemmas. So how does this actually play out? Well, let's take animal experimentation for medical research. Act utilitarianism mathematically justifies it because, in this view, the immediate pain inflicted on the animals is massively outweighed by the future extent of human lives saved. Or picture a terrible car crash. A doctor arrives, but they only have time to save one person. A pregnant mother, a young husband, or an elderly man. If we plug this into the hedonic criteria, specifically looking at fecundity and extent, the math is incredibly unyielding. You save the pregnant woman first, no question, because she literally represents 2 lives and has the highest mathematical potential for future pleasure. The elderly man? He comes dead last. It's a highly practical system, sure, but it is undeniably cold. But wow, does this mathematical approach get dark quickly? Have you ever heard of the Jim and the Indians dilemma? Jim is forced into a situation where he's told to shoot one innocent hostage, and if he does, the rest will be freed. But if he refuses, soldiers will execute every single one of them. Under ACT utilitarianism, Jim absolutely must pull the trigger. The math demands it. And we see this exact same utilitarian math in modern military dilemmas, like the use of nuclear weapons as a deterrent. The threat, or even the actual use, of a devastating weapon is completely justified under this theory if the sheer terror it causes mathematically prevents a longer, much deadlier global war. It can justify potentially horrifying actions if that final calculation just shows a net positive in saved lives.
Which brings us to Section 4, Mill's Rule Utilitarianism. This is where the calculus evolves.
So John Stuart Mill steps onto the scene to try and fix some of the really glaring, almost animalistic flaws in Bentham's cold calculations. Mill realized that pure ACT utilitarianism lacked something profoundly human. See, Bentham thought all pleasures were strictly equal. Whether you were playing a goofy pub game, drinking gin, or reading high poetry, if it brought the exact same amount of pleasure, it was morally equal. Mill fiercely disagreed with this. He argued, better Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. He genuinely believed that human beings should strive to fulfill their highest intellectual potential, not just chase base-level satisfaction.
Basically, Mill's fix was to shift this whole theory from purely quantitative, just blindly adding up points, to qualitative. He separated pleasures into categories. Higher pleasures are intellectual pursuits, reading, art, philosophy, music. Lower pleasures are your basic, physical, animalistic desires. For Mill, a higher intellectual pleasure is always going to hold far more moral weight than any mountain of lower, basic pleasure.
Plus, Mill realized something pretty obvious. You just can't practically run a 7-step math equation every single time you need to make a choice in life. So he developed rule utilitarianism. We look at human history and we create general rules, like don't lie or don't steal, because historically, those rules have consistently produced the most happiness. He also introduced the harm principle, which states that the majority absolutely cannot interfere with a minority unless it's specifically to prevent harm. Under Mill's rules, the math changes drastically for our earlier dilemmas. Establishing a universal rule against unnecessary animal cruelty or forging strict global treaties against using nuclear weapons arguably provides way more long-term stability for society than Bentham's cold case-by-case calculations ever could.
But wait, what happens when a generally good rule gets in the way of an immediate need for happiness? That brings us to Section 5, Strong versus Weak Rules, the breaking point of utilitarian laws.
You essentially get two camps of followers here. Strong rule utilitarianism says that once a rule is established for the greater good, it must absolutely never be broken, no matter what the circumstances are. But Mill himself was essentially a weak rule utilitarian. He believed rules are vital guidelines for sure, but if you absolutely have to break a rule to save a life, like, say, stealing expensive medicine from a pharmacy to save a dying child, then the specific situation actually demands that you break the rule for the greater good.
Okay, time for Section 6, the flaws of utilitarianism. Do these theories actually hold up in the real world? Let's critically evaluate all of this.
So, to quickly recap our two frameworks, Bentham's ACT utilitarianism is pure quantitative and evaluates every single unique act entirely on its own. It has unswerving absolute integrity to the math. On the flip side, Mill's rule utilitarianism is a qualitative hybrid system. It relies on universal rules to try and protect justice and individual rights, which arguably makes it a lot more practical for actually running a functioning society.
But let's be real, both of these systems have some massive, glaring weaknesses. First off, it is literally impossible to accurately predict long-term consequences. Think back to the nuclear deterrent example. Can any of us really predict the long-term geopolitical fallout of constantly threatening nuclear war? If our math is even slightly wrong there, the result is literal global annihilation. Second, there's the terrifying potential to justify genuinely horrific acts. If the math works out on paper, ACT utilitarianism can justify horribly abusing a minority group or inflicting immense pain in extreme animal experimentation as long as it supposedly yields a majority benefit. Plus, defining what pleasure even is remains incredibly subjective, and constantly calculating every single choice you make is just not how human beings actually live.
Which brings us to our final slide and a really provocative question that I want to leave you with today. Can any moral theory truly be practical if it requires us to accurately know the future? Utilitarianism demands that we measure the consequences of our actions to find the greater good. But if the future is completely unwritten and consequences are always shifting, are we ever really sure we're making the right choice? It's a profound puzzle and one that absolutely forces us to look closely at the math behind our own morality.